Hey, Neil McDonnell here. We will get started in just a second as I let LinkedIn push out there. I tend to just watch my phone for those of you here early. By the way, I like to say this, anybody who shows up kind of early, if there's a pressing question you have of the day related to government contracting, shoot me a private message. You can ask me right now and I'll be happy to answer it online here with everybody. Or if you'd like to just shoot me a private message on LinkedIn, do that. Okay, I think we're good. I can see myself on LinkedIn. Again, I'm Neil McDonnell. I'm the president of the GovCon Chamber of Commerce. And if you're not familiar with me, I've been spending 20 years as a small business owner. And since 2018, I've been teaching folks like you that government contracting is not a secret. It's just a process. And that process is really from A to Z and all the steps in between. And that's what I like to talk about here on LinkedIn. So welcome to my LinkedIn Live. This is where I discuss process and procedures to help you achieve success in the federal market. Today, I want to talk on I want to talk about the difference a little bit on federal market and commercial. Sometimes I see people getting into the different markets and maybe treat them the same, or you think there's similarities in there. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference to give you tips for success. But then the other thing is, I always lean a little bit more onto why do I advocate for the federal so much? It is because there's so much maturity in this big, huge, diverse market. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today as I share these tips with you. So if you have questions about what I'm talking about, feel free to throw them in the comments. But let's get started with, when you compare the federal side to the commercial side, the federal side is very regulated. It's super regulated. An example is the federal acquisition regulations, huge set of rules, guidance, laws that tell the government how they must behave when they're buying services or products to support the mission of the departments around the federal government. And so there's this huge body of regulations that guide everything they do. An example is when they're doing market research. They must prove out that they've done market research and tried to be fair out there, finding the best deal for the government, while also giving perhaps maximum participation to small businesses. On the commercial side, there are no regulations that guide all of the companies out there. They can do whatever they want. Each individual company, whether it's Walmart and Amazon, whether it's AOL or the mom and pop store down the road, AT&T, it doesn't matter who it is, no matter what industry it's in, the healthcare, finance industry. On the commercial side, there's no one body of knowledge they must all follow, or body of regulations they must all follow for procuring things. They buy or procure whatever is best for them. And so when you go into the federal customers and you're trying to buy, you can get a general awareness of the sales life cycle or the process, both from the rules standpoint in the FAR, which I say don't go too far into trying to understand the FAR perfectly, but also the process. So first, you think about regulations that tell you what you can and can't do. On the commercial side, they're not really there. You have a lot more flexibility to work with the customers and just bend whatever you're trying to do to meet their need and to be able to really be highly competitive in there. An example is you can take people out to lunch, take them out to dinner, you take them to Hawaii for all the commercial side cares, right? Each individual company might have guidelines for their people. What I'm suggesting is the commercial, or let's say the financial industry, does not have one way they procure. They all do it their own separate ways. There's this body of ethics they follow. Ethics is different than laws. Ethics is optional, and we hope you behave ethically, right? A lot of us think it should not be optional, but laws are mandated. And so the federal acquisition regulation lays down that mandate for the federal buyers compared to the commercial buyers not having it. But when you go to the next level of process, what's the sales life cycle when you look at the commercial and federal? And so let me describe it first from the federal. In the federal life cycle, and I've done other videos and you can go back and look at them. I think I've even done them on LinkedIn Live, so they might be in these replays. But in the federal government life cycle, it basically follows the same generic process I'm going to tell you. Somebody comes up with an idea, right? Light bulb moment, and they say, this is what we need. And the idea could be generated from people downrange doing the mission, and they say, we need more of this. Or it could come from people saying, hey, we want to go to the next level of maturity of our agency, our department. Emerging technology is coming out. Or when you think about buildings, maybe we want to have energy efficient buildings. Somebody has an idea and they start beginning to delve into that idea, learn more about what could fit the agency and serve the needs that they're identifying, even maybe shaping their needs to be more clear, going from implied needs to explicit needs, very clear needs. And all of that part to me is what I call informal market research or requirement development. They're thinking more about their requirements and they're exploring, let's say, the internet, right? They're exploring people on the internet who are talking about zero trust or about artificial intelligence or about new janitorial cleaning supplies that can be a lot healthier for the environment, for the people there. Whatever it is, they're doing that informal research, trying to understand what they want more. As it moves forward, it moves into this formal phase where they notify the contracting officer that they're looking at potentially acquiring something, procuring something for their department, their program office. And it begins to enter this formal process where they've identified a need. Perhaps it gets on an agency forecast. And then as they move forward, they might begin to define or identify budget that can be used for this requirement they have. They go into a formal market research where they're doing two things. A formal RFI where they're requesting information from the industry to teach them, talk to them, help them understand the requirements better, or a sources sought where they're looking at who's in the market right now that might be able to serve them. Are there women-owned businesses out there that could serve this need they have? Are there generally just generically small businesses? What contract vehicle might be the best one to go out, or which NAICS code to use? Anyways, that level of market research is where they're at. And then they move in farther into the formal process as they get into the RFP part, where they might drop some draft RFP documents. And then they do a pre-solicitation notice, maybe 15 days out, and then they drop an RFP, then they get proposals, then they do an award. Whatever it is, there's this formal process that happens within the federal space that is pretty clearly defined across the board. The buyers within the federal government all are tending to go to the same training that's out there. Certainly, like the Defense Acquisition University trains DoD buyers, et cetera. There's this process that's well defined and then well taught. And so you see commonality when you go from agency to agency, even when you go from defense to civilian. The process is basically the same. Flip that over to the commercial side, and it's harder in here because on the federal side, that could be 6 to 24 months. That's that life cycle. How long it takes from the minute somebody's got an idea or they know they want to recompete something to when it's awarded. On the commercial side, their needs are driven by similar activity, but they have a lot more flexibility for urgency. So they have similar long-term needs. They might identify in a hospital that they need a piece of equipment 2 years out. This one's going to be hitting end of life. We want to replace it, and it might be a $2 million piece of equipment. On the other side, sense of urgency, if they've got something they want to get in place, let's say they want to stand up a cyber operations center or something, and they need to get going and to address an immediate need. Well, they can move pretty fast on it. And the acquisition approach is completely independent to each one of those companies. And so my recommendation to you is if you're going into commercial, it is tough because you can't go through the same process with everybody. You can have a broad general idea of how people buy, right? The implied need leads to an explicit need, leads to a defined requirement that, hey, we are going to go out, leads to an acquisition approach, right? We're putting something out for bid. At a high level, that's where it's at. When you go into commercial companies, if you go into commercial companies, you want to ask them very definitively, what's your process? When you buy something, what is the process you go through? If you're trying to serve a particular hospital, that might be able to have recurring or repeating, not repeating, but recurring or different bids that are going to come out that you might want to go after. What's the process? How do we hear about it? When do they drop? because it's not like there's a forecast. And coming back into the federal side, right? There's a forecast of all the federal procurement, basically. And SAM.gov is where most everything that's going to be bought by the federal government is listed. There's all sorts of little exceptions, but let's leave those for a second. SAM.gov is a great central repository. All the contract vehicles that might be out there, if things are feeding through there, then those contract vehicle portals are a central repository. And maybe a third place is agency forecasts. When they're doing those properly, they'll have forecasts out even a couple of years saying, hey, this is where we're thinking we're going to be buying. On the commercial side, because there's no centralized way to find that on the commercial side, and I don't mean product bidding, I'm really focused on construction and services. Bidding is a little different because it could hit bid boards and it's really a commodities game. But on the services side, when you work with a commercial customer, you want to understand what's your process. How do I hear about requirements you might have that I can serve other than just through a relationship? Obviously, you want to do relationships. I just did a webinar yesterday talking about the value of relationships. And you can watch that replay. By the way, if you missed it, I'll put a link in the chat. But when you are going into the commercial side, you want to ask them, how would I know about new requirements that are coming out? And unfortunately, you really have to zero in on the people who are going to own the requirement you have. So if you're in IT, for example, you need to get to know the CIO or the CIO's direct reports that are going to be responsible for what you sell. And then you just need to be staying in touch with them on a regular basis. On the federal side, having those relationships and staying in touch with them is one way of hearing about opportunities. But there's also a lot more ways to hear about it because they're very formal in trying to tell industry about here's what's coming out. An example is industry days. One of the things the chamber is getting ready to do with a whole bunch of other organizations is really create a centralized repository of industry days. Well, in industry days, you will see the government talking about here's what's coming up. Most often, I'll look at an agency's industry day slides and see them talking between 10 and 30 different opportunities, and these tend to be larger opportunities. But you can see them out and you can plan, and so it helps you. On the commercial side, you need to be a little bit more proactive. You need to get in there and ask them, what's the process for when you're doing acquisition, and what's the how can I hear about new opportunities? What's the forecast? So another thing I want to talk about as it relates to commercial and federal that you just got to track is understanding people's roles. I describe in sales that people fall into three roles. They're either a focus of receptivity, meaning they're willing to talk with you and help you however they can. So a focus of receptivity. They're a focus of dissatisfaction. This is the person, the program office typically, who has the need. I need new servers. I need to build a new hospital wing. Whatever it is, they're the ones with the need. And that's what makes them dissatisfied. They're either dissatisfied with a problem and they want to fix it, or they're dissatisfied with a limitation and they want to increase their capability or their capacity to get things done. The focuses of dissatisfaction can be program offices like an IT department, or it can be the users all the way at the end. Each one of you is a focus of dissatisfaction to Google or Microsoft if you're using them, for example, as some tools to run your day-to-day operations. If you use those tools, then you are also a focus of dissatisfaction. And when you communicate to Google or Microsoft that you have a problem, they're able to consolidate all those problems, turn them into really concise needs that they have, which then they let their vendors know. And that's how we come downstream. So focus of receptivity, focus of dissatisfaction. The last one is focus of power. Focus of power is really the people who can make the sale happen. It's always the person with the money. In the government space, it's very easy. It's the contracting officer for sure. That person, she's the focus of power for anything you're selling. And I'll come back to more focuses of power in a second. On the commercial side, it could be anybody, right? And this is where I'm trying to go with focuses of receptivity, focuses of dissatisfaction, or focuses of power. By the way, focuses of power are the ones who can sign it, but also the ones who have heavy influence. And so when you look at a commercial customer, you're going to find out what's your process for acquisition, idea, market research, pre RFP and then RFP or whatever they call it, right, in their organizations. So you're doing that, and then you're identifying, and you want to throw in the forecast so you can know about it. But then you're identifying people in the roles. And so when you look at those roles, you want to begin to find out who do you need to reach. Obviously, the people you need to reach more than anybody else in sales is the focus of dissatisfaction. And they're more important to me than the focuses of power, and just in priority, because the focuses of dissatisfaction can tell you about a problem. They can tell you about their goals, what they want for their organization, and this could be commercial or federal. And focuses of dissatisfaction can influence the focuses of power. Just because the contracting officer signs something doesn't mean that they're really the most knowledgeable about this purchase. They are depending on another group of powerful people. In the federal government, they call it selection board. And you basically have the same thing in the commercial side. Who's going to look at the proposals that come in? Who's going to sit there and evaluate them for pricing and technical competence? And then those people are influencing the contracting officer, saying, "Hey, I looked at all the proposals. These two firms did a great job on pricing, past performance, and technical approach. I like them. Let's go this direction." And 9 times out of 10, the contracting officer is going to listen to that person on the commercial side, that person of power who signs the final contract with you. They're going to listen to their selection board, whatever the other name you might use there. But a selection board just is a group of people who review proposals and basically grade them, right? They evaluate the proposals. And so as you go forward, you want to understand these roles and begin to identify them in the commercial space. On the federal space, and I talked about this yesterday as well. So again, you can go a deeper dive into that masterclass I did yesterday in the replay. But in there, I talk about the contracting officers, obviously the focus of power. The program office is generally the focus of dissatisfaction. You've got all sorts of other focuses of dissatisfaction. But in the federal space, you're trying to get into that program office who's generating the requirement. From there, you can expand to other people. But really, that's your primary person. And then in the focuses of receptivity, you're very fortunate that you have small business professionals in the federal space. In large companies, by the way, very large companies, commercial or federal, they have small business liaisons. These two are small business professionals, just like on the government side. And their job is to advocate their internal customers' needs to industry, saying, "Hey, this is what we need. This is what we're looking for." They're also charged with finding great vendors that might be able to help their organizations with their mission. And so bringing you back to the program office as an example would make sense for a small business specialist if you present yourself as a company that could solve that program office's needs or mission that's going forward. So small business specialists in particular, small business liaisons, these are really good focuses of receptivity. Less knowledgeable about the technical requirements, but more knowledgeable about the agency or the company, more knowledgeable about, hey, I can make this introduction. Let me get the name, number, and email, et cetera. So those are roles. Keep those in mind as you move forward. And then as you move forward, one of the other things that I like to talk about from a commercial side and a federal side, in the federal side, you have this huge advantage that the entire federal government basically works as one, right? There's so many agencies and sub-agencies in the federal government that there is no single definitive list. It's a conversation that happens in Congress constantly where they look to the executive branch and say, well, how many agencies do you have? It's like, I don't know. How many countries are there? They change all the time. It's like 195 today, 196 tomorrow. It doesn't matter how many there are. They basically work as one. I talked about they follow the federal acquisition regulation, right? A general set of guidelines. There's a CPARS tool. This is the tool that is basically Yelp for federal government contracting. And so any government contracting officer can look into CPARS to see how did you do before on previous contracts, and they can share that lesson back and forth. There's SAM and DSBS, which is a single repository of all small business suppliers, but SAM is also a single repository of past and current opportunities. You can go into FPDS and USA spending. You need to become very familiar with these terms. When I talk about the FAR, for example, you need to be very familiar with the FAR, but you don't need to like the word FAR, and you need to understand the idea. You don't need to know every word, but you should be able to say, oh, the FAR, that's regulations. CPARs, that's Yelp reviews. SAM and DSBS, that's the where all the government contractors are registered to do business. It's where I can learn about points of contact in there. SAM.gov now is also where current contract opportunities are, where past contract opportunities are. FPDS and USA Spending are where past contracts are, a different way of looking at past contracts to see how they were awarded. And that's a body of information that we have in the federal space because we operate basically as one in the federal government, but thousands of buyers, right? If you looked at my one of my videos early on in LinkedIn Live, I talked about how there's over 200,000 buyers in DoD alone in the acquisitions life cycle. There's like 170,000 military and civilian personnel in DoD that have some job related to acquisition, right? Their job category is acquisition. And then there's all these other people, focuses of dissatisfaction, the program offices, who are participating in the acquisition, but more from the requirements level. Those are on top of here. And all of those different people, all of those different agencies, commands, et cetera, come down and kind of operate in one common way. A lot of differences in there, but basically one common way, the federal government way. On the commercial side, it's different. And so you need to be able to get in and understand what is given to us in the federal side. If you want to sell to the commercial side, what I recommend you do is you have a set of questions that are common to digging into a customer. What's your approach for acquisition? Where's your forecasted opportunities? How can I learn about current contracts that you have that you might be rebidding later on? Sales is much harder in the commercial side than the federal. In the federal side, it's very tight regulations and how things are done. So if you write a really good proposal, that could be good enough. In the commercial side, you need to get in there and meet with that customer. You need to influence their thinking. Why would they bump out an incumbent and bring you in? But on the federal side, they basically are bumping out an incumbent and then saying, hey, let's recompete. Often incumbents will win. But on the commercial side, they don't even have to bid it out again. If they get an incumbent, that company can stay there 20 years. And so you need to be able to get in and shape it. I'm trying to look down here as I look at my time, and the last tip I wanted to give you for just, when you think about commercial and federal, I obviously like this idea of federal, and any chance I get, I say, if you're coming into federal, just go all in, because you can build a $100 million firm in the federal government on top of each other. One thing leads to another type scenario. But what I'm trying to do today is go, how can you take the maturity of the federal government acquisition world and duplicate some of that over into the commercial side so you can start seeing commercial success? And so this is the last tip I want to give you on a way to go for commercial business while you're in the federal space, but still staying pretty focused and staying close to that set of general approach and rules, guidelines, process, et cetera, that the federal government does. My recommendation is, if you want to go to the commercial side, find commercial companies that are doing business in the federal space so that you can team with them on federal opportunities. You can prime sometimes, you can sub sometimes. But when you go over to the commercial side, when you go to their commercial customers with them, now you're working out there. And so an example is, I talked about this before. I built one of my last companies. It started by having Booz Allen as a huge customer. At the beginning, it was like 80% of my revenue and a lot of revenue. So it was a great customer, but they were also in the federal space. So I could go in there. You can find this in the health sector, finding companies like Cerner, which is a huge, huge organization that's doing $10 billion worth of health IT work in the federal space. And so by going over to them, you can support them here on the federal side. You can perhaps support them inside Cerner for their own internal needs, and you can perhaps connect with them to go serve their other customers. So it gives you these three channels of revenue all through that, for example, that one example company, but following a federal process into that, if that makes sense. And you can do, when I look at this, you can do the same thing in construction, in manufacturing. And the reason I tell companies to do this, especially companies that are under, 30, 40, 50 million, is because you're still learning. Even if you're making 20, 30 million, you're still learning. You're still figuring out, how do I get the process going? If you're starting to get close to 30 million, you're getting ready to go large in the government's standard, you need to compete full and open. Well, when you do things like this, you diversify yourself. It's the same reason we tell 8A firms, don't just go after 8A set-aside contracts. Try to go after small business contracts and try to go after full and open contracts. When you do that, you're diversifying your ability to win, but all in the same kind of target customers, or all in the same focused approach to core competencies, teaming partners, et cetera. So I'm going to pause there. I hope you found this valuable. I'm getting close to the end. I want to see if there's questions, because I definitely saw some comments in here. Glad you guys are saying hi back and forth. That's perfect. Spot on. We have both federal and commercial customers. While our customers hire us for program management, financial management, most of the rest help with CMMI and ISO. Oh, I think I know who that is, but you're coming in as LinkedIn user at the moment. That's perfect. I appreciate you chiming in. I'm not the only person. It's great when we get someone else out there. Another person started with commercial, added state. Next up, first federal. Oh, Deborah, we should talk. So, hey, David, by the way, if you guys aren't tracking on David, he's currently rising up to be one of my favorite people, because he's coming to the LinkedIn Lives, but he's one of the small business professionals I talked about early on, who's in the federal space. He's in the Navy, but he's a great person to follow up with. And David, I got to get you on to do a guest spot on here. And he's, by the way, if you're looking at this, he's saying, reach out, talk to him. There's things that he can share with you. Thanks for that tip at the end too. Okay, I think I'm at the end. If you found this valuable today, give it a thumbs up. One of the things that I'm going to do, just giving you a heads up, is I'm trying to find topics that I can stretch out for the week, where I can, it's like 5-day training periods, if you will. And you can either watch them live or in the replay. That's, it's all fine for me. I just want to keep delivering good content. But if you've got areas that you're struggling with, let me know. I'd love to sit there and work on topics that drive straight to anybody's immediate needs that are there. Thank you very much for everybody as putting into the chats. I love it when I see the engagement, because I think you all can help each other. If you have questions later on the topic I shared today, feel free to just message me. If you're not connected on LinkedIn, either connect with me or know that I'm probably going to connect with you. And last thing is, remember, government contracting, it's not a secret. It's just a process. I'll see you next time.